In this, the 27th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we take a closer look at the debates raging in the late 1960s and 1970s over the role of government in the economic affairs of nations. Ideology has never disappeared from the debates, and as the United States and the global economy experience regular periods of boom and bust, the arguments over law, over regulation, and over taxation intensify. In the face of deeply rooted economic problems and social unrest, change was inevitable. What that change would look like in the United States depended on whether the next U.S. president and the composition of the U.S. Congress would take an ideological or a pragmatic approach in policy and legislation. The U.S. seemed on the verge of implosion in 1968. War raged in Southeast Asia, where thousands of young American soldiers were dying for reasons few understood and even fewer supported. Returning veterans marched with other young people in protest. Racial unrest exploded in riots across the nation after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. Robert F. Kennedy emerged to challenge Hubert Humphrey for the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. He too was murdered. At the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the police rioted, attempting to control anti-war protesters. Richard Nixon promised to bring the war to a successful conclusion and restore respect for law and order in the nation. Nixon won by a popular vote of 500,000 over Hubert Humphrey. Nixon claimed to speak for a silent majority, a great middle whose values were distinct from those on the vocal left or the ideological right. Upon taking office, Nixon set down the challenges for the nation as he saw them. In his inaugural address, he said, "In pursuing our goals of full employment, better housing, excellence in education, in rebuilding our cities and improving our rural areas, in protecting our environment and enhancing the quality of life, in all these and more we will and must press urgently forward. We shall plan now for the day when our wealth can be transferred from the destruction of war abroad to the urgent needs of our people at home. The American dream does not come to those who fall asleep, but we are approaching the limits of what government alone can do." In April of 1970, the first Earth Day was celebrated. In September, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by President Nixon, and in his 1973 State of the Union address, he told his fellow citizens, "Land in America is no longer a resource we can take for granted. We no longer live with an open frontier. Just as we must conserve and protect our air and our water, so we must conserve and protect the land and plan for its wise and balanced use. Some progress is being made, but antiquated land use laws, overlapping jurisdictions, and outdated institutions are still permitting haphazard development, which can spoil both the utility and the beauty of the land." Yet President Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors was on the whole orthodox and conservative. Military spending continued to climb, and in 1973 the war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria prompted Saudi Arabia to impose an embargo on oil shipped to Israel's ally, the United States. Other member nations of OPEC quadrupled the price of oil, and Americans faced both shortages and rapidly rising prices. Escalating energy prices affected all areas of the U.S. economy. By 1974, inflation reached 12%, causing disruptions that led to even higher unemployment rates. President Nixon faced the dual challenges of high unemployment and inflation while trying to win the war in Southeast Asia. The late 1960s experienced yet another cycle of credit-fueled speculation in land and real estate. Through the vehicle of real estate investment trusts, commercial banks were adding fuel to already inflationary land markets. The banks provided the funding, but played no role in analyzing the viability of projects or the quality of borrowers. Construction financing provided by the REITs poured $2.5 billion into housing and other real estate developments in 1970, and another $3 billion in 1971. Between 1969 and 1973, REITs grew particularly fast, holding about $20 billion in assets by 1974. Landowners and speculators took full advantage of the growing demand as baby boomers entered early adulthood. Some critics commented on the extent to which fertile agricultural land at the edge of the nation's cities was being taken over by sprawling development, and how city neighborhoods and even entire cities were falling into decay. Entire new infrastructures were required to support this movement of people. Little advance thought was given to where the money would come from to pay for it all. Continuously rising prices in the 1970s eroded the real income of millions of U.S. workers. By 1974, the U.S. was spending $30 billion on imported oil. World food prices were also skyrocketing. The cost of health care began to rise steeply. Yet there was complacency among the middle class. The economist Walter Heller explained, "When the cost of fulfilling a people's aspirations can be met out of a growing horn of plenty, ideological roadblocks melt away and consensus replaces conflict." A growing concern, however, was just how long this horn of plenty would remain in the face of rising inflation. On advice from his Council of Economic Advisors, Nixon took steps to slow inflation. Export subsidies for wheat and rice were discontinued. Payments for keeping farmland unplanted were curtailed. Wage and price controls were adopted. What Richard Nixon understood from history is that U.S. presidents are less likely to be reelected during times of high inflation than in times of high unemployment. The unemployed, discouraged, are less likely to vote in elections. Keynesian economists were forced to admit their macroeconomic theories failed to take into account the supply-side problems causing the 1974-75 downturn. Remarkably, few had anything substantive to say on the importance of the skyrocketing increases in land prices or its role as a driver of the business cycle. Land prices, and hence housing prices, were rising much faster than household incomes. The expanding secondary market for mortgage loans encouraged construction lending and overbuilding, pushing up land prices even more. The oldest of the baby boomer generation were now young adults and beginning to form new families, putting pressure on the existing housing stock and driving land prices up and up. U.S. government spending continued to outpace revenue, creating a rising national debt. The deficit for 1975 came to $44 billion. This increased during 1976, with Gerald Ford now in the White House, to $66 billion. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, blamed the Congress and called for budget reform. On the plus side, the rate of inflation fell during 1976 and 1977, and the number of people reemployed was slowly increasing. Yet the number of people who sought employment but were unsuccessful was actually growing. Millions of women were now in the workforce and seeking full-time employment, either because of economic necessity or because working outside of the home was what they chose to do. Millions of teenagers and college students sought part-time employment. OPEC and the great transfer of purchasing power to OPEC member nations resulted in cost of living shocks spreading around the globe. As observed previously, the United States was ill-prepared for the sudden and dramatic increases in the cost of fossil fuels. A significant portion of OPEC revenues was being recycled through the banks to less developed countries as infrastructure and development loans, creating a scenario for an explosion of a giant debt bomb down the road. The ability of many countries to service this debt depended on ever higher prices for exported raw materials. By 1979, the LDCs owed over $400 billion and were hit by rising interest rates. At the same time, recession reduced global demand for their commodities and goods. Jimmy Carter entered the White House in 1977 with a promise to both balance the budget and cut taxes. He was able to do neither. Carter tried unsuccessfully to bring Germany and Japan into a coordinated effort to stimulate economic growth. The U.S. dollar continued to drop in value against foreign currencies, and OPEC raised prices to compensate for the dollar's lost purchasing power. Investments with fixed rates of interest were losing money due to inflation. And finally, the core component of inflation, escaping attention, was the doubling of land prices between 1970 and 1974. Crashes in the property markets would bring down land prices, but only temporarily. After experiencing some number of mortgage loan defaults and foreclosures, the property markets would eventually renew an upward climb. Interestingly, in a radio interview given in 1980, Margaret Thatcher seemed to grasp the destructive power of the property markets as the primary source of inflation and stress in the British economy. Thatcher stated, "We got an artificial boom, and do you know where the money went? It did not go into investment or expansion. It went into the biggest property boom we've ever seen, and I don't wish to see the like of it ever again." The boom eventually collapsed, and in the meantime, inflation rose and rose, and eventually unemployment rose again. And yet, as Fred Harrison concluded in The Power in the Land, Mrs. Thatcher could not bring herself to challenge mainstream economics. Fred Harrison wrote, "Mrs. Thatcher would not admit that the disposition to speculate was an intrinsic feature of the existing land market. She blamed government deficit financing for the speculation of the early 1970s. All that the policymakers need do then is to restrain the temptation to finance public spending by printing money. This solution is spurious." By the beginning of 1981, President Carter and his advisors believed the nation was coming out of the period of stagflation. In his State of the Union message, he said, "We are now in the early stages of economic recovery following a short recession. Typically, a post-recessionary period has been marked by vigorous economic growth, aided by anti-recessionary policy measures such as large tax cuts or big stimulation spending programs. I have declined to recommend such actions to stimulate economic activity because the persistent inflationary pressures that beset our economy today dictate a restrained fiscal policy." Outside of government, a handful of economists for several years had been warning of a land bubble on the horizon. J. Bruce Linderman, an associate professor at Georgia State University, wrote in 1974, "In many suburban areas, speculators are outbidding developers. Outlying land of dubious use potential is trading briskly. Most alarming is the obvious effect being made to bring outsiders into the land market. Vigorous syndication efforts and even the current popularity of dubious land development purchases are hailed as innovative and exciting applications of marketing." Carter's economic team had virtually nothing to say about how to tame the property markets. We have reached the end of Lesson 27.